Hey folks, welcome to another IEM review here on Passion for Sound, and today we're taking a look at the ThieAudio Hype 10. And this is a really interesting review to me because as you can see on screen right now, I think ThieAudio are doing something that's not the best idea. I've talked about this once before. Some people at the time thought that I had some issues with my measurement rig. This is a brand new measurement rig using a 711 coupler. It's a clone version. And as you can see here, if we measure let me bring the labels back. If we measure the ThieAudio Hype 10 in blue, the ThieAudio Monarch Mk in green, and the ThieAudio Prestige Limited in red, they all measure basically the same until you get up into the treble. And so I think on one hand, this is great because it runs pretty close to my personal preference curve, which is the dotted line. It's also a little bit of a problem in the sense that you can't get different tunings from ThieAudio. If you want something with a bit more treble or a bit less treble or a bit more mid-range, it's bad luck if you want to choose from these options. So it's kind of curious. I don't really know what ThieAudio are doing there, why they're consistently pumping out the same sorts of tunings. But the question for me today was to take a listen and see whether or not the Hype 10 being cheaper than the Monarch Mk and the Prestige Limited, whether that's actually the best option of the bunch to save yourself some money and actually get what appears to be the exact same sound. So let's find out. First of all, I'm going to listen to the Hype 10 on its own and just see how it sounds without thinking about any other IEM, and then we'll do some direct comparisons. If we have a look at the graph here, as you can see, and I've already said this, it aligns pretty closely with my personal preference. This is not a target curve, this is my preference curve. I don't believe an IEM has to follow any particular shape because I've seen lots of IEMs that have different shaped curves that sound fantastic. However, this is what I tend to like as a starting point in an IEM. The thing that I do notice is there's a bit of extra energy in the 1 to 2,500 hertz range. That could be a bit of a problem for me. There's also a little bit of a lump close to 4K, which can be a sibilant area. And so that's a bit of a concern. The 8K peak here, we can largely ignore. That's a coupler artifact. It's a resonance within the coupler when you measure them. So we're going to have a listen. Before we do though, I've got the outer sleeve of the box here. And I just wanted to grab it and check quickly the specifications. So I've got an 18 ohm impedance, which is fairly low, but not crazy. Sensitivity of 105 decibels, I'm guessing per milliwatt. And we're using 10 balanced armatures, 2 dynamic drivers, and is a 4-way crossover. So the way this works, this is using the Impact 2 or Impact Squared system for the bass. And what that means is that within the Hype 10 shell, the 2 dynamic drivers are actually working together, firing into an isobaric chamber. And the idea of this is you can use 2 dynamics running at a lower level, so you're not stressing them as much, but producing twice as much bass by having them kind of fire into a common chamber and create extra pressure. So I'm guessing with the 4-way crossover, we've got bass obviously coming from the dynamic drivers, and then we've maybe got a sort of an upper bass, a mid-range and a treble, or a mid-range treble and high treble potentially. I haven't actually looked at the website. Let's take a look now. And so it's not dissimilar to what we've seen before on other models. It's a continuation of the things like the Hype 2 and the Hype 4 that I've also reviewed. I haven't particularly liked any of them so far. They're not bad, but I haven't kind of loved any of them. So this talks about the Impact 2 here. Okay, so it's using ultra tweeters, so I'm guessing... Oh no, so it is actually using just a bass mid treble by the sound, but... Have they given us their crossover layout? No, they haven't. Not that it really matters. I was just curious. So anyway, let's come back and have a look at the price, which you might want to know if you haven't looked already. So the price on these comes in at $899 US, and that sits them below, as I said before, the Monarch Mk and also the Prestige Limited, despite the fact that they all measure pretty similarly. So let's have a listen to the... before I go into that, in terms of accessories, it's not a great accessory set on the Hype 10. If you saw yesterday's video of what was yesterday's video? The ThieAudio Nico, you get a lovely range of tips, you get a couple of different connectors. It's a nice kind of setup of accessories. What you get with the Hype 10 is much more basic. You get the carry case that I've got here. You get the IEMs themselves, which in typical ThieAudio style look beautiful. They're a really high quality molded acrylic shell, or at least they feel high quality. You get a nice cable. It's the same cable we've seen on the Monarch Mk, Prestige Limited, etc. It's got alternating or swappable connectors, so you can have 3.5, 2.5 or 4.4mm connectors. And then we get a couple of little baggies like this one that's got the connectors, but the other baggies have a range of tips. So I guess ultimately you're getting the same approximate accessories as you do with the Nico, it's just not quite as nicely presented if that matters to you. I don't really care about those things because I take them out and I use them. I'm not looking at the packaging, but the Nico is laid out just a little bit better in terms of that initial presentation, if that matters to you. Putting all that aside though, let's take a listen to the Hype 10 and see how it goes. Now, as I'm putting the tips on, something that's worth talking about here, because I've had a few people criticize me in the past about how I think a certain IEM, like say the Monarch Mk, isn't particularly bassy. They say it is. There's two things to mention here. One of them is that we actually all have different physical resonances and sensitivities to different frequencies. So your sensitivity to bass might be different to mine. You might hear this as very bassy. I hear it as kind of much more neutral and natural. Also, we need to take into account how the treble interacts with our overall perception of sound. We don't hear sound one frequency at a time. We hear it all frequencies at once. And so the amount of treble you have, and mid-range for that matter, in relation to how much bass you have, that's all going to alter your perceptions of the audio. And so it's important as you're listening to any reviews, whether it's mine or somebody else's, it's important to start aligning your understanding of your hearing with what somebody else says. And that's where sites like Squiglink can be so fantastic. You can go onto Squiglink, you can take an IEM that you might already know well and have an understanding of, compare the graphs and work out for yourself if that particular sound suits your taste. What does that mean when you look at this other IEM, for instance? So if you love IEM X, put IEM X up against IEM Y, and you can see where they differ and which ones might suit you. Having said that, that does only tell you about frequency response. It's not going to tell you about the character of the sound, the staging that it presents, any of those sort of other things that are not captured in a simple frequency response graph. Frequency response only tells us the general tonality, not the character, so how harsh, refined, smooth, grainy, etc. it might be, and it doesn't tell us about staging and stuff like that either. So with that said, let's take a listen to the the Hype 10, and see how it sounds. So as somewhat expected from that listening experience, because I kind of already knew what these were going to sound like, I know the Mark III, the Monarch Mk, and the Prestige Limited, it's a sound that's very, very good. It just has a little bit too much energy in the treble for me to be completely relaxed with. And that's where I find the extra energy in the 1 to 2.5 kilohertz range, the bit of a bump around 4 to 5 kilohertz. It's just when offset with this slight drop in the mid-range, it makes for an IEM that I don't find as relaxed to listen to as I would like. They're an excellent IEM, technicalities are strong, staging strong, general tonal balance is quite strong, but they're just a little bit too contrasty between the mid-range and the treble for me to properly relax into. If you've seen my reviews of the ThieAudio Prestige Limited and Monarch Mk, where I spoke about the fact that for me the Prestige Limited is just a slightly more refined version of the Monarch Mk, that's kind of continuing the theme here where it sounds very similar to what I'm used to. I do want to do a quick listen to the Monarch Mk because price-wise, there's about $100 in it from memory. Let's have a look. And by the way, thank you to Lynn Sol for sending over the Hype 10. So Monarch Mk, yeah, so $9.99 for the Mark III versus $8.99 for the Hype 10, and yet very, very similar tuning. One of the differences though is that the Mark III, as you can see here, is using the same impact driver setup for the bass, the dual dynamic driver setup. It's using some balanced armatures, but then also some electrostatic tweeters in there, or electret tweeters, depending on how you look at it. So that's worth keeping in mind, that the quality of the treble should be different, even though the actual measurement is the same. If I just bring back the Monarch Mk, the actual quality should change because we've got a different driver type that has its own characteristics. I think what I'm also going to do is bring in the Sennheiser IE600 because it's cheaper, but I think it's actually a sound that I'm probably going to lean towards preferring over the Hype 10. We'll have a listen and see. I'm going to start though. Let's turn off the, I'm going to change that over to, yeah, it doesn't really make much difference. The X-Elastic tips do much the same job. I find the stock tips on the Sennheiser is not particularly great, so I'm going to get rid of that one. And we'll change the color of that as well. Whoops, down here. And again. So let me just turn off the Sennheisers for a second. And we're going to start off just with the Monarch Mk versus the ThieAudio Hype 10. I don't think I said before in this video, all listening's being done with the Chord Mojo 2 and the Chord Poly. And so let's go with the Hype 10 versus the Monarch Mk 3. This is really interesting. I've just left on screen. You can see I'm listening to Livin', Lovin' and Doin' by Eric Bibb. It's a nice recording. It's a pretty light acoustic guitar. There's drums and I think there's a bass guitar in there as well. I wasn't paying attention to the instruments so much, but the thing that was really interesting was going across to the Monarch Mk 3. They've got a little bit more energy in the upper treble. Whether it's because they've got more energy. So some of this is the artifacts from how you insert the IEM, it changes the position of some of these peaks exactly. But the reason I don't worry about trying to align those is because every IEM is going to be slightly different in terms of where the drivers are placed within the IEM, and therefore the length of the total canal distance from the eardrum back to the drivers is going to change, and the resonance is going to change. So I personally don't believe in aligning the 8K peak because it can make for some really unusual insertion depths with the IEMs into the coupler. That's a whole nother topic. If you want me to talk about it, leave a note in the comments and I'll do a short video at some stage. The thing that stands out to me as I listen to the Monarch Mk 10, try again, the Monarch Mk 3, too many numbers to go on here. The Monarch Mk 3 has a sense of refinement in the treble. It's a little bit like what I said in the Monarch Mk 3 versus the Prestige Limited. As you go from the Hype 10 to the Mk 3 to the Prestige Limited, each time all you're really doing is stepping up the refinement. In the case of the Hype 10 to the Mk 3, I do feel like there's a slight addition of some nuance, some clarity, some detail in the treble that was missing a little bit from the Hype 10. I think other than that though, they're so similar. If you have the extra $100, I think the Monarch Mk 3 is technically superior because it is delivering that sense of nuance and detail in the treble. It doesn't come across, despite, if you follow the green line, it's technically got more treble energy throughout most of the bandwidth. But at the same time, it comes across smoother to me as I listen to it. There's a slight edginess to the treble in the Hype 10. It's very slight, and it's my personal sensitivities, so a lot of people won't have an issue with it. But despite my sensitivities, the Monarch Mk 3 just has a consistently more enjoyable treble from the moment it starts to kick up at 1K all the way through to the top end. And as I said, it brings out more detail, texture, and nuance as a result. So I don't mind the Hype 10. I think it's a solid IEM, but I think for $100 more, the Mk 3 is worth going for. And then the question comes down to whether or not you go the extra step into the Prestige Limited, or whether we look in a completely different direction and maybe save some money, and do we go with something like the IE600? So that's the other IEM I want to check out now. As you can see, it's quite a different tuning in some ways, but very similar in others. We've got more sub bass, which I always enjoy. We've got a little bit less in the sort of upper bass or mid bass area, and then actually more energy around the 2K mark to 3K mark. That's going to be interesting, but it then drops away in the sibilant range of sort of 4 to 5 kilohertz. So there's a few interesting things going on here. Ignore the extremities of this peak here. This could be that coupler resonance. So let me try now the Hype 10 up against the IE600, because at this stage, what I'm thinking might happen is that I'm going to tell you to either spend less and get the IE600, or spend more and get the Monarch Mk 3. But let's have a listen and see. I tried a few different recordings then. I've finished up on A Street by Leonard Cohen, and this is a really interesting one. If I just go back to the measurements for a second, and I'm going to hide the Singolo, but I'm going to come back and talk about why I put that up. The sound from these two is not vastly different, as you'd expect, because, you know, from the majority of the mid-band of these, they're quite similar. But the IE600 does come across a little bit smoother. It also benefits some of the treble emphasis that it's got over and above something like the Hype 10 is offset by this sub-bass emphasis or presence that it's got down low. And so this goes back to what I said before, that we need to take into account the full frequency range, not just hone in on the fact that there's a teeny little bump here and therefore think that the IE600 is going to be brighter because it's also offset by other frequencies within the range. The long and the short of it is, I think both of these are excellent IEMs. The sound is a bit drier from the Hype 10. The treble has a little bit more sense of, I don't know if you'd call it texture or grain. It's not as smooth to listen to. For me, it's a little tiny bit fatiguing. Some of that could be coming from the energy around the sibilant band, where you get the S and the T type sounds. So for me, I do think I would go down to the IE600 in terms of spent money. I'd go down to the IE600 rather than spend the money of the Hype 10. Or if you prefer the look of the tuning with a bit less of the sub bass and maybe a slightly more kind of even treble contouring, then I think the Monarch Mk 3 is probably the better choice. So it's an interesting one. I realized before that I haven't really talked about the technicalities of the Hype 10. And what I would say is I think it's doing a really good job in general. I don't think it's outstanding. I think stage is good in terms of width. Depth is just okay. I don't think it's exceptional. The IE600 delivers a little bit more depth. Neither of them is massive in terms of depth. The separation and imaging is very strong from the Hype 10. But again, that's where I think going to something like the Monarch Mk 3 with a slightly more nuanced treble is going to bring you better gains in terms of detail retrieval, resolution, and therefore the image accuracy and focus is just a little bit better as well. So I think the Hype 10's solid. I'm not going to sit here and rave about it though. I think it's worth spending a bit more to go to the Monarch Mk 3 or a little bit less and go down to the IE600. And something else I want to talk about here. I think I'm not necessarily a fan of the impact bass system that ThieAudio are using. And the reason I say that was as I was thinking about it and listening to it, the measurement of the bass on the Hype 10 and indeed the Monarch Mk 3 as well, the measurement of that bass would suggest that it should be quite a solid and impactful bass. And indeed the marketing would suggest that too. But as I thought about it, when I reviewed the very cheap, comparatively, very cheap Kiwi Singolo recently, I'm just going to turn off the IE600, the Singolo measures with just a little tiny bit more bass in terms of its measurement, but you feel the bass from the Singolo. And I never felt the bass from the Hype 10 or the Monarch Mk 3, or indeed the Prestige Limited, but that doesn't use the impact system. The way the bass is being produced from these IEMs isn't providing impact from the bass. You don't feel it. It's not tactile. And I think that's possibly part of what's going on here. And it goes back to what I said at the very beginning about the limitations of frequency response graphs. You don't get to see the character of the different frequencies, the character of their delivery when you look at the graphs. And that's to say that the character of the bass from the Monarch Mk 3 and the Hype 10 is fairly polite. It's not a deep, impactful, punchy bass in the way that something like the Singolo is. And that's where, for me, I do actually think the Singolo, from a bass point of view only, and I'm only talking about bass here, but the Singolo has this amazing tactile bass that's not enhanced much beyond what the Hype 10 does, but you feel it more, and therefore it brings a sense of energy and life to the lower registers. And that's where I think if we go back to the IE600, the IE600, whilst it's doing it differently by having some extra sub-bass presence, the IE600 is delivering a sound that I think is a little bit more impactful in the bass. It helps to balance the top end better, and that for me makes an overall better tonally balanced IEM. So there's a lot that I've just sort of spewed out there in terms of thoughts and impressions and subjective details here. The long and the short of it is I think the Hype 10 is a solid IEM. I think if you want a slightly more dry, neutral, treble-oriented tuning than something like an IE600, then the Hype 10 might make sense. But I would personally recommend that you save a little bit more money and go up to the Monarch Mk 3 if you're in that sort of budget ballpark anyway. I think that's the better choice. So the Hype 10 for me is solid. It's not one that I'm going to rave about. I think it's a good, decent IEM, but I think you probably can do better for your money by going down or up, as I've just said. And so hopefully this has been helpful and useful for you in making up your mind, deciding where to put your money, etc. As always, if it has been helpful and useful, please hit the like button and also subscribe and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music. So happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.